Welcome to the 5th episode on the life of Saint John of the Cross. That is the last part of his life. After the Good Friday experience in the prison, John begins to enjoy the glory of the resurrection. During the last 13 years of life, except the few months before death, it was a glorious career. He held very responsible and high positions among the Reformed Carmelites. First, he was a superior of El Calvario Monastery in Beas. Then he would be the rector of Baeza Seminary. Then the superior of Los Martires Convent Monastery in Granada. He becomes the vicar provincial and the provincial of Andalusia until the 1588. The last three we will see later. And during these 10 years in Andalusia, three important events take place. First, it is there John becomes a writer. While staying in El Calvario Monastery as the superior, he was also confessor of the nuns of Beas, the Carmelite, cloistered Carmel of Beas, which was founded in 1575, where Anne of Jesus was the prioress. He goes to every week for hearing confession and give him a spiritual instruction. And the theme or the topic of his instruction were naturally the prison and the mystical experience he had in the prison. And sisters felt that such a sublime talk should not be limited only to that group of Beas Carmel. They said, Father, you should write down so that others also may benefit of these spiritual talks. It is how he started to write. And three of his four important major works were done while in Beas and Baeza. Naturally, namely, Ascent of Mount Carmel, the Dark Night, and the Spiritual Canticle. And the Spiritual Canticle was dedicated to this Anne of Jesus. So, we must say it is the nuns who made him a writer. Second event is, as when he was provincial in Andalusia, staying in Granada, he corrected two priests. Priests were very famous preachers, but were often outside the monastery. As provincial, he told them to regulate their ministry so as to have a few days to spend in the monastery of the fathers, so that they should live the reformed lifestyle of fasting, abstinence, and so on, which they had to obey, but they resented it. We'll see toward the end of his life. Third is his spiritual friendship with a young widow, Ana de Peñalosa, and she was a mystic. John could understand the depth of her spiritual life, and for her, John wrote the last major works, The Living Flame of Love, which has only 4 stanzas. And she asked him to write a commentary on that, which he did in 2 weeks. And it was going on. In 1588, there was the general chapter in Segovia. John goes to attend. Segovia is in Castilla. Until then, he was in southern province of Andalusia. During that chapter, he would be elected as the assistant general and the superior of the generalate and secretary of the general council and so on, very high and responsible officers. Then, what happened was, when John moved to Segovia in the northern part, The widow who was in Granada found it difficult to accept the absence of her spiritual father. So she moves to Segovia, because originally she was from Segovia. After marriage she got settled in Granada. So her parental home was in Segovia. And she bought a piece of land and built a house, and she was staying there. Besides, being a rich woman, she donated a piece of land to her spiritual director, Father John, to build a new monastery and a new church in Segovia. But a good gesture, but she made a condition that when my spiritual director, Father John, dies, wherever it may be, the mortal remains should be brought back to Segovia and be buried there. And Father Dory and other superiors did not bother about it, this consequence, and accepted. And during that chapter of 91, John ceases all the offices because the term is over. And during that chapter, he was left without any office, though he was promised to be he was requested to be the mission superior of Mexico in South America. But John declined. He said, I prefer to remain in Spain and to go to any monastery. He was given the permission to go to any monastery in Spain. And his good friend Antonio, with whom he began the reform, becomes the provincial of southern province of Andalusia. And he invited him to the southern province and asked him to choose any monastery. And then he preferred a monastery up in the mountains, the place called La Peñuela. During the first few months in the monastery of La Peñuela, he spent the first few months revising his writings and spending in a solitary contemplative prayer in the woods of La Peñuela. He was enjoying it, the life. But after a few months, he had a wound in the leg, which later became cancerous and could not be treated in that hilly area. So he was taken to the nearby town, which is called Úbeda, in view of better treatment. Unfortunately, the superior of that monastery at that time was Father Crisostomo, one of the two he corrected. And that man ill-treated him in many ways. But John felt it. Somehow, 2 days before his death, he called the Father Superior and apologized, saying that, I'm sorry for the trouble I caused in this community, especially for the expenses which were incurred for my treatment. And then he said to the Superior, Father, a day will come, nothing would be lacking to this monastery. When Chrysostom saw that, like St. Peter, he repented and wept bitterly. On the other side, the other man, Father Diego, who was then general definitor, who wanted to expel John from the order, and for which he made some defamatory accusations. That means John had an unhealthy relation with women, a cheap weapon to kill a priest. And one of his good disciples, one Juan Evangelista, wrote to John saying, Father, there is a move to expel you from the order. And John wrote back to that young priest, my son, don't be afraid. If they can expel me, only if I do not accept the punishment they impose on me. And I'm prepared to accept whatever punishment they would give. So they cannot expel, so don't worry. So on one side he has physical suffering, on the other side he has the moral suffering. And going through, that was his last 6 months of passive night of the spirit. We will see later, John, while speaking about the passive purification of the spirit of the suffering, the three kinds of suffering, he says, to some people, this thick night and hard moments may recur. When John wrote it, he never thought that it would happen to him, but it happened to him. The last 6 months were a time of suffering and pain. In that agony, he died. On the 14th early morning, it is said, when the community was having the matins at midnight, John breathed his last and was buried in Obida monastery. Then, after a few months, our widow comes up. She reminded Father General of the condition she had made. When my spiritual director, spiritual father, dies, his mortal remains should be brought to Segovia and be buried in the monastery for which I have given the land. And they had to do it. It is said, 2 or 3 priests accompanied by men opened the tomb, which was, then they realized it was incorrupt. So they waited for some time and brought back to Segovia, not through the direct road, through some side roads and so on, because it was done at night. And it was a long journey from Ubeda to Segovia via Cordoba and Cordoba and Madrid. And it was brought to Segovia monastery as the widow wanted. But then when the people of Ubeda came to know that the body was taken to Segovia, they protested. They said it should be brought back to the place where he died. That's a custom. The man is buried in the community where he dies. So it's moreover, the fame of his sanctity was already public. It was not just a dead body. It was a dead body of a saint. So they wanted to have that privilege to have their saint buried in their land. And finally, this conflict reached the Vatican and they reached a compromise. That is, to cut his incorrupt body in two, from waist upward for the people in Segovia, and the legs and other bottom part of the body for the people of Ubeda. So his dead body is in 2 places, in Segovia and in Ubeda. And even now, in Ubeda, it is kept up in a big urn, and in southern part also in a reliquary. And that's the end of John. Even after his death, people did not leave him free. And he was, to make it short, in 1726, on the December of 27th of December, 27th of December in the year 1726, he would be canonized by Pope Benedict XIII. So now he is the saint, one of the glorious saints in the church, and in particular, he would be a glorious saint for the Carmelite order. And when we analyze his writings, I will tell you, when he was declared doctor of the church, when he was declared the patron of the Spanish poets and so on, which I will explain in later when we speak about his writings. So that's the end of his life.